When I woke up that day, everything seemed ordinary. Liam was already out in the field, preparing the tractor for spring planting. His schedule was as predictable as the changing of the seasons, and in that predictability lay a certain stability. I made breakfast, washed the dishes, folded the laundry, rituals I used to fill my days with some semblance of meaning. But lately, something had started to weigh on me. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was always about practical matters: bills, the fields, the weather. There were no spontaneous touches, no evening walks like before. And that hurt. But the real pain came later. I was climbing the stairs when I heard his voice. Liam was speaking to someone on the phone. "I don't know, Jim." His voice sounded tired. She, Clara isn't the same as she used to be. It's like we're living near each other, but not together. I love her, but she doesn't inspire me anymore. It's like working the land that no longer yields crops. Every word hit like a hammer. I froze in place, as though my feet were rooted to the floor. Doesn't inspire. That word lodged in my mind like a splinter. I quietly backed away, trying not to make a sound. Liam left the house shortly after the call, completely unaware of my state. His face was as focused as ever, and I smiled at him as though everything was fine. But inside, I was breaking apart. When he drove off, I was left alone. The house suddenly felt too quiet, the air too heavy. I tried to keep myself busy with chores, but my hands trembled, and my thoughts kept circling back to his words. I had become a stranger to my own husband. Not knowing where to turn, I decided to go to the church. Not to pray. I wasn't particularly religious. I just needed a place where I could be myself, even if only for a while. The church was empty, save for one person. I had seen him last week when he conducted his first service, the new priest, Oliver Gray. Tall, with dark eyes that held an inner light but also a shadow. He noticed me immediately, though I had tried to slip in unnoticed. "Are you here on an errand, or just looking for a quiet place?" he asked gently. I froze. His voice was calm, but not indifferent. There was something about it that inspired trust. Just, I hesitated. I just wanted to sit for a bit. He nodded, motioning for me to take a seat. "The church is always open for those seeking peace," he said, sitting down a respectful distance away. "If you'd like to talk, I'm here. If you'd prefer silence, that's fine too." His words were simple, yet comforting. I closed my eyes, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. "Have you ever felt like you've become invisible?" I asked suddenly, not looking at him. He didn't answer right away. "Everyone feels that way at times," he finally said. "But sometimes it means we've stopped noticing ourselves." His words struck a chord. I looked at him. His gaze was intent, almost probing, but not judgmental. "It's hard to explain," I whispered. "You don't have to," he said. "What matters is what you feel." I didn't know how to respond, but somehow, just being heard made me feel lighter. As I left the church, the sun was setting, bathing the streets in a soft glow. I felt a little better, though the question, "what now?" still hung in the air. I didn't know then that this was just the first step towards something that would change my life forever. The church became my refuge. Liam didn't object when I started going there more often. On the contrary, he seemed almost relieved when I explained that I needed some time to sort myself out. "That's good, Clara. If it helps you, I'm all for it," he said once over dinner, not even lifting his eyes from his plate. His words sounded sincere, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was just glad I was leaving him alone. Oliver was attentive, but kept his distance. Each of our encounters was limited to a few words, sometimes just a nod. Yet somehow, that was enough. There was an unpretentious humanity about him that made our brief exchanges meaningful to me. One evening after the service, he stopped me at the door. "Clara, are you in a hurry?" His voice was soft, but there was a seriousness to it. I was surprised. He rarely asked me to linger, and it caught me off guard. "No, I'm not," I replied. Then come to the garden, he suggested. Sometimes silence there helps more than words. The garden behind the church was quiet, enclosed by a low stone wall. The evening light cast shadows that danced along the paths and rose bushes. I walked ahead, feeling a strange tension building inside me. Something is weighing on you, he began, leaning on the back of a bench. I see it every time you come here. I tried to smile, but ended up just shrugging. I suppose everyone carries something inside, I said, sitting across from him. Everyone has their burden. But not everyone seeks a place to put it down, he countered, his voice calm yet piercing. Silence enveloped us. I stared at my hands, searching for the right words. Liam, he's a good man, I finally began. Caring, honest. But sometimes I feel like I'm just a piece of furniture in his life. Oliver frowned, but didn't interrupt. He doesn't see me. He doesn't even try. I'm trying, I really am. But it feels like, to him, I'll always be right where I'm supposed to be. And it's breaking me. My words echoed in the quiet of the garden. Oliver didn't respond right away. He just looked at me, as if trying to decide how to reply. Sometimes the people closest to us lose the ability to see us for who we are, he finally said. It's hard, but sometimes we have to remind them ourselves. His words touched me. For the first time in a long while, someone wasn't just listening, but truly understanding. We sat in silence again, but this time it felt thick, almost tangible, like the air had weight. I lifted my gaze and met his eyes. There was something in them I couldn't describe. Sadness, understanding, and something more. Suddenly, he leaned closer. It happened so quickly that I didn't have time to process it. Our lips met. It was a brief but intense moment, like a flash of light in a dark room. Oliver pulled back immediately, as if struck by lightning. Clara? His voice was hushed, almost pained. I'm sorry, that shouldn't have happened. I stared at him, stunned, unable to say a word. That was a mistake, he continued. You need to leave. His eyes were filled with guilt, but in them, I saw a reflection of my own emotions. Had I really wanted this? Or was it just a moment of weakness? I stood up without a word and walked toward the exit. When I got home, Liam was already asleep. His breathing was steady, measured, and I paused for a moment, looking at him. He seemed so calm, so familiar, and yet utterly foreign. His words from that day echoed in my mind again. She doesn't inspire me anymore. Now those words cut even deeper. But what scared me most wasn't that. It was the fact that, for the first time in years, I felt alive. In those days, I was desperately searching for distractions. Every evening, I found excuses to spend more time away from home. Liam didn't seem to notice. His days were consumed by work, and our interactions had dwindled to mundane exchanges. What's for dinner? When will you be back? One evening, while at the church library, I stumbled upon an old journal. Its cover was worn, its pages yellowed, but inside were the thoughts of a priest who had served there many years ago. His words struck a chord in me. He wrote about battling loneliness, searching for God, and the place where he felt closest to him, a small cabin in the woods. I decided to find that cabin. Perhaps I hoped that a change of scenery would help me escape thoughts of what had happened between Oliver and me. The forest was quiet, almost oppressively so. I followed the path, guided by the description in the journal. The cabin was hidden among the dense trees, a humble structure with a sagging roof and peeling paint that made it look abandoned. But as I approached, I noticed signs of recent activity. Branches along the path had been cleared, and the door was slightly ajar. When I stepped inside, I was surprised to find it unexpectedly tidy. An old wooden table, a couple of chairs, a dusty window barely letting in the light. And there, standing by the window, was Oliver. Clara? His voice sounded surprised. I froze, unsure of what to say. I read about this place in a journal from the library, I admitted, feeling as though I'd been caught doing something forbidden. Oliver sighed and shook his head, leaning against the windowsill. This place isn't for everyone, he said, but I come here sometimes to be alone. It's truly special, I offered, trying to ease the tension. He didn't respond, just looked at me as if trying to understand why I had come. Why are you here, Clara? He finally asked. I hesitated. Why was I here? Was I seeking peace, answers, or something else? I wanted a distraction, I said at last. After everything that happened, his gaze softened. We both know it was a mistake, he said. I know, I replied. We stood in silence until he gestured for me to sit. We talked about how difficult it could be to find a place where one could simply be oneself. For the first time, I heard about his doubts, doubts that mirrored my own. Being a priest isn't just about faith, he said. It's a constant reminder that you're supposed to be an example, even when you're unsure of your own actions. His words were so genuine that I felt something shift inside me. And what if you don't want to be an example anymore? I asked. He looked at me, but didn't answer. There was a struggle in his eyes, one that I recognized in myself. I couldn't help but notice how restrained he was. Oliver tried to keep his distance, but his eyes told a different story. I felt it, and I could no longer deny that I was drawn to him, not just as someone who understood me, but in a way I hadn't felt with Liam in a long time. As I prepared to leave, he walked me to the door. Clara, he said before I stepped out, sometimes the right choice is the hardest one to make. I nodded, unable to respond. His words echoed in my mind as I walked home through the woods. But what if I no longer knew what the right choice was for me? Liam suggested going to the town fair over breakfast. It was unexpected. He usually wasn't the one to initiate such outings. You hardly spend any time in town, Clara. Maybe a change of scenery would do you good, he said, pouring himself coffee. His voice was neutral, but I detected a hint of insistence. I didn't want to go, but refusing would have seemed suspicious. Sure, why not? I replied, trying to sound cheerful. The fair was loud and crowded. Children ran around with cotton candy, and the voices of vendors filled the air, inviting people to sample their goods. Liam held my hand, as if to show everyone we were together. It felt strange and a little awkward. Remember the first time we went to a fair? He asked, smiling. I nodded and smiled back. Things were so different then. We laughed, went on rides, and bought trinkets. Now it all felt like a distant memory. We walked past a stage where someone was singing folk songs and headed toward the bakery stalls. Liam stopped to chat with a farmer he sometimes worked with. I glanced around, and my heart skipped a beat. Oliver stood by one of the booths, talking to a group of parishioners. He looked relaxed, even a bit cheerful, which surprised me. I rarely saw him like that. Our eyes met, and I felt my face flush. His smile faded for a moment, replaced by an expression that could only be described as concern. He gave me a barely perceptible nod, but it was enough to make me feel exposed, as if someone had caught us. Clara, are you listening to me? Liam's voice brought me back to reality. What? Sorry, I replied, realizing he'd been asking me something. I was asking if you'd like something to eat. You look a little pale, he said, his tone concerned, though there was something else in his eyes. No, I'm fine. It's just the heat, I said, trying to deflect. But soon, I noticed how he watched me. His gaze was sharp, guarded. I could tell he suspected something, but he didn't know how to ask. When we returned home, Liam said very little. I took the chance to retreat to the bedroom and hide the candle I had inadvertently taken with me. It was an old church candle with engraved symbols I had found on the table in the woodsman's cabin. To me, it seemed significant, something I wanted to keep. But Liam came into the room shortly after. What's this? His voice came from behind me. I turned to see him holding the candle. It's just a church candle, I replied quickly, hoping my voice sounded steady. Why do you have it? You can't buy these in a store, he said, scrutinizing me. I took it from the church. Oliver said I could have it. I lied, desperate to avoid more questions. His gaze lingered on me, but he didn't push further. All right, he said finally. But Clara, you've been different lately. Are you hiding something from me? No, of course not, I said with a smile, though I felt a knot tightening inside me. He nodded but didn't look convinced. That night, he stayed up late, and I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Everything was becoming more complicated. Every step, every glance seemed to carry weight. I felt my world crumbling, yet I couldn't stop it. Worse still, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The rumors started spreading so unexpectedly that I didn't even realize how it happened. The town was small, and it seemed even the shadows on the walls could whisper. One of the parishioners claimed to have seen me leaving the church late in the evening, long after the services had ended. She told her friend, who told someone else, and soon everyone knew. At the morning service, I noticed a few women casting sidelong glances in my direction. Their whispers seemed louder than the tolling of the bells. I sat with my head down, trying to convince myself I didn't care. But I did. After the service, Oliver approached me. His gaze was tense. "We need to talk," he said, nodding toward the courtyard. I knew this wouldn't be easy. The courtyard, with its sunlit benches, had always felt like a peaceful place to me, but now it was filled with unease. Rumors spread quickly, Clara, he began, his hands clasped behind his back. People are starting to ask questions. It doesn't matter, I interrupted. It does. His voice sharpened. They're not just talking about you. They're talking about me. I'm a priest. I can't afford such conversations. I felt a wave of anger wash over me. So, the only thing you care about is your reputation? I snapped. Oliver hesitated. No, he said quietly. I care about you. Those words hit me harder than I expected. I looked at him, and our eyes met. Then why do you keep pushing me away? I asked. You act like you don't care, but I see that's not true. Oliver lowered his eyes, as if searching for an answer. Because what's happening between us could destroy everything we've built in our lives, he said. You don't understand, Clara. This isn't just a mistake. It could ruin us. Nothing can ruin me anymore, I replied, my voice trembling. Do you think I don't know this is wrong? But it's the only thing that makes me feel alive. Oliver raised his head, and in his eyes, I saw what I had been searching for in Liam for years. Understanding. Clara, he said, stepping closer, we can't. You can keep saying that, but we both know it's not true, I interrupted. Silence hung between us again, but this time it was different, charged with tension and an emotion that could no longer be ignored. Oliver took another step, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest. He hesitated, but I could see his resistance fading. When our lips met, everything else disappeared. This kiss was unlike any before. It held more pain, more desperation, more truth. But it didn't last long. Oliver pulled away quickly, breathing heavily. We can't, he repeated, but his words felt hollow. I stared at him, trying to understand what he would do next. But instead, he just turned away, as if to hide his emotions. Clara, he finally said, I'm asking you, don't come here alone again. And what am I supposed to do? I asked. Find a way to live without this? He replied. His words sounded rational, but I knew I couldn't follow them. What had happened between us wasn't just a mistake. It was my truth, no matter how wrong it might be. I left, feeling something vital inside me shatter. I no longer knew what was right or wrong. The only thing I knew for sure was that this wouldn't be the last time. I didn't know how much longer I could endure it. Every time I left the house, I couldn't summon the courage to look Liam in the eyes. He didn't ask questions, but I could see his gaze growing more guarded, almost distant. There was a coldness in his demeanor that I couldn't ignore. That day, I told him I was going out for a walk to clear my head. He nodded without even looking at me. "Of course," he said. "Some fresh air will probably do you good." Guilt surged inside me. His voice was calm, but beneath that calmness lurked something dangerous. Still, I forced myself to walk out the door, pretending everything was fine. I headed toward the woods, where Oliver said he would be waiting. We hadn't explicitly arranged to meet there, but I knew he often walked along that trail to think in solitude. The forest air was fresh, damp from the previous night's rain. I followed the narrow path, feeling my heart begin to race. Each step brought me closer to Oliver, but it also magnified my fear. I knew this was wrong, knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't stop. When I saw his figure in the distance, my breath caught. He was leaning over a large rock, as if studying something on its surface. "Oliver!" I called out, and he turned. His face lit up with a smile, but I noticed the unease in his eyes. "You came," he said softly, taking a step toward me. "You knew I would," I replied, trying to keep my emotions in check. He gave a small nod, but said nothing. We stood facing each other, the tension between us almost unbearable. "Oliver," I began, unsure how to continue. I I can't keep pretending everything is fine." He frowned. "Clara, this isn't something we can keep doing. It's gone too far." "But why?" I interrupted. "Why do you keep telling me no when you can't stop yourself either?" He fell silent, his gaze heavy. "Because I don't want to ruin your life," he finally said. "Or mine." My heart tightened. "Do you think my life isn't already ruined?" I asked. His eyes met mine again. "I'm trying to protect you," he said. "Protect me from what? From you?" I nearly shouted. "From both of us," he whispered. My words caught in my throat as he stepped closer. We stood so close I could feel his breath. And in that moment, I realized there were no more words left for us. When our lips met, everything else faded away. It wasn't just a kiss, it was something more, filled with pain, fear, desire, and desperation. But this time, we were seen. On a small rise among the trees, Liam stood watching. He had seen everything. I didn't notice him there. Neither did Oliver. Liam remained motionless, as if turned to stone, but his face showed something I could hardly comprehend. It wasn't anger or betrayal. It was a silent, searing pain. He turned and walked away as quietly as he had arrived. When I returned home, Liam was already there. His face was unnervingly calm, and that scared me more than anything else. He stood by the table, looking at me as though studying me. I opened my mouth to say something, but he cut me off. "Don't," he said softly but firmly. He removed his wedding ring and placed it on the table. "I thought I could handle this, Clara," he said, his voice steady. "But now I see I was wrong." I froze, feeling everything inside me collapse. "Liam," I whispered, searching for the right words. "Don't," he repeated. He picked up his coat and walked out the door, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly felt empty and cold. I stared at the ring on the table. My hand trembled as I picked it up, tears streaming down my face. In that moment, I realized I had lost something important. But what terrified me more was that I no longer knew if I could ever get it back. The church was filled with people. It was one of the most attended Sunday services in recent memory, and even those who usually skipped such gatherings had come. I sat in the back row, trying not to draw attention. My gaze was fixed on the altar where Oliver stood. He looked different. It seemed that in the past few days, his face had aged, and his shoulders had slightly slumped under the weight of an invisible burden. I knew he was preparing to do something significant. Liam was sitting at the other end of the hall. I could feel his presence, but dared not look in his direction. This was the first time we were in the same place since he had left the ring on the table. I knew he wasn't here for the service. He had come to hear what Oliver had to say. When the chime of the bell announced the beginning, Oliver ascended the pulpit. His voice, usually calm and confident, carried a slight tremor this time. "Dear parishioners," he began, "today I wish to speak to you not just as a priest, but as a man." A hush fell over the church. Even the children, who usually whispered or fidgeted on the benches, grew silent. "All of us gathered here know that the path of faith is a path of struggle," he continued, "a struggle against our fears, weaknesses, and inner demons." His words echoed in my heart. He wasn't speaking about religion, but something far deeper and more personal. "I am no exception," he said after a pause. "I am not a saint. I am a man, like all of you, and I too make mistakes." I felt eyes turning toward me. People whispered, trying to decipher his words and their intent. "When I came here," Oliver went on, "I believed I could be an example for you, someone who helps others find the light. But during my time in this parish, I've realized one important thing. No one can be flawless." He paused, as if summoning courage. "I have made a decision," he finally said. "This is my last service in this church." Shocked gasps swept through the hall. People stared at him in confusion, and some had already begun to murmur among themselves. "I am leaving," he continued, "because I believe my struggle should no longer be yours. My role was to help you, not to bring turmoil into your lives." These words were addressed to everyone, but only Liam and I understood their full meaning. Oliver was admitting his guilt without naming names or revealing details, conveying the truth in every pause, every word. I looked at him, my heart breaking. He spoke with such sincerity that it frightened me. He was giving up not only his position, but a part of himself. "Forgiveness," he said, looking at the congregation, "is not just a gift we give to others. It is something we must grant ourselves." His eyes briefly met mine, and I understood that he was speaking for my sake as well. The service ended sooner than I had expected. People began to leave, exchanging whispers and astonished glances. I remained in my seat until the church emptied. Liam walked past me without a word. His face was unreadable, and I couldn't discern what he was feeling. When everyone had gone, I approached the altar, where Oliver was gathering his papers. "Are you really going to leave?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Yes," he replied without looking up. "Why?" I whispered. He finally looked at me. "Because it's the only right thing to do," he said. "For you, for Liam, for everyone." I couldn't find the words. There was an emptiness in my chest I didn't know how to fill. "And for you?" I asked. He hesitated. "For me, this will be the hardest trial," he admitted, "but perhaps this is my path to redemption." I wanted to argue, to say that his departure wouldn't change anything, that it wouldn't solve my problems, but he stopped me with a gesture. "Clara," he said gently, "we cannot undo what has already happened, but we can try to ensure it doesn't destroy us completely." His words felt true, but they didn't make it any easier. I stood there, watching him pack his belongings, realizing that this was the end. When I stepped out of the church, the sunlight felt cold. Everything around me was just as it had always been, but I knew that from now on, everything would be different. I had lost something important, and perhaps I would never get it back. The bridge had always seemed to me like a place to hide from the world. As a child, I would come here to watch the water slowly carry away leaves. In those moments, everything felt simple. But today, the bridge looked different. It no longer symbolized peace, but the chaos of my life. I knew I would find Liam here. He often came to the bridge when he needed to be alone. He never spoke of it openly, but I noticed his habit of retreating here after a difficult conversation with his father, or when things on the farm weren't going well. This time, it was different. It wasn't just a hard week or exhaustion. This was the end of something big. When I approached, he was leaning on the railing, staring at the churning water below. His shoulders were tense, and his figure radiated an unspoken weariness. Liam, I called softly. He didn't turn, but I knew he heard me. I stepped closer, trying not to make a sound. Why are you here, Clara? He asked, finally turning his head. His voice was calm, but there was a cold detachment in it. I need to talk to you, I said. Talk? He let out a bitter laugh, turning away again. Do you think words will change anything? I fell silent. His words were fair, but no less painful for it. I understand that you're hurting, I began, and I know I deserve it. You know? He turned abruptly, his gaze filled with anger. Do you know what it's like to see the person you love kiss someone else? To wonder if you were ever good enough? I took a step back, unprepared for the intensity of his emotions. It's not like that, I started, but he interrupted me. Not like that? He laughed bitterly. Clara, you can't even explain why you did it. Because I felt lost. The words burst out of me. His expression softened, but the pain was still there. Lost? He repeated quietly. Why didn't you tell me? I tried, Liam, I said. But you were so busy with everything else, you didn't see me. I didn't feel like I mattered to you anymore. And you found someone who made you feel that way, he said, looking directly at me. His words hung in the air like a stone dropped into water. That's no excuse, I whispered. I know that, but I can't undo what's been done. Liam turned away again, staring at the water. For several minutes, we stood in silence. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said finally. I understand, I replied. But I'm also not sure if I want to leave, he added, his voice faltering. Those words surprised me the most. I felt a lump in my throat grow. Why? I asked. Because despite everything, I still love you, he said without looking at me. And I hate myself for it. I took a step closer, but he raised his hand to stop me. No, Clara, he said. Not now. I can't just forget. I felt my strength leave me. His words were honest, but they tore me apart inside. What do we do? I asked, almost in a whisper. I don't know, he replied. But for now, I need time. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing on the bridge. I watched him until his figure disappeared around the bend in the road. I was alone. The bridge beneath me, the water below, the world around. It all felt surreal. I leaned on the railing, watching the current carry the leaves away, just like it had when I was a child. But now, everything was different. The leaves no longer felt like symbols of something light and carefree. They were a reminder that nothing could be undone. The camera slowly pulls back. The world seems to pause, leaving the viewer with a question. Will Liam and I find our way back to each other? Or does this story end here?